prefaces critical emancipatory praxis and demands of the critical to confront its own limitations, codes, dogmas, and doctrines, and to discard its own self-certainty. In short, the series is about a critical that is self-critical. Critique within the critical has the renewal of our cultural traditions, institutions, knowledges, and practices in mind. And this is exactly what Ihron's book is about and more. He works through demanding and courageous reflective processes of self-clarification to work at the UJ project with intellectual agility, social humility, and political and programmatic dexterity, steering it into one of the big success stories of our sector. Apologies for not acknowledging people present here and on YouTube individually. It would just take too long, so no disrespect intended on that score. Yet you would forgive me if I acknowledge his wife, Sizeka, and Lizo, his son, and close family and friends whose intertwinement with Ihron's life vibrates throughout the pages of the book. A warm welcome then to the following: members of the general public and many of UJ and other alumni, anti-apartheid activists and struggle veterans, authors, journalists, columnists, the presence of the published African Sun media, members from religious institutions, various representatives of organizations and corporations from the business sector and civil society, state-owned enterprises, and others. Guests joining from universities and organizations in other time zones, the team from King's College London, Ihron's other academic home, the leadership and members of the NRF, CSIR, HSRC, and CHE, Mandela University chairperson, UJ council members and ombud, former and current senior executives of UJ, and those directly representing Prof Marwala's office. We also have present here today amongst around 350 RSVPs, staff and students, former and current council members, VCs, DVCs, deans and deputy deans from 17 and perhaps more public and private higher education institutions in South Africa. Current USAP board members and staff, welcome as well. And to former and current DGs, DDGs and senior executives of the National Library, National Employment Fund, various CETAs, municipalities, state and public organs, the Departments of Science and Innovation, Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Basic Education, Higher Education and Training, and International Relations and Cooperation. The Ministry of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, ambassadors, envoys and diplomats, ministers and deputy ministers. I hope you can sense our gratitude, warmth, and hospitality from both UJ and NMU as we welcome you to this book launch. Please be reminded to interact on the live chat on YouTube and those on Zoom. Please also use the chat or Q&A function on your screen. I am now inviting Prof Ihron Rensburg to share a few reflections. Let me take a quick moment to introduce her. Professor Ihron Rensburg has been awarded the Sarchi Chair, Teaching and Learning by the National Research Foundation, South Africa. Previously, she was the head postgraduate studies at the University of Johannesburg and a professor in the Faculty of Education at the same university. Prof Rensburg is an established rated researcher, and her research areas of expertise include equity and social justice, teaching and learning in higher education, schooling, access to higher education, finance, education policy, and postgraduate education. She has recently edited the book From Ivory Towers to Ebony Towers, Transforming Humanities Curricula in South Africa. Thanks to you, Ihron. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Prof Geert, Andre, and I'm thrilled to be associated with this event. There is a huge storm in Johannesburg, so if there are additional sounds other than my voice, you'll know why. You can hear the thunder in the background. So I just want to start off by saying that it's a great honor to be associated with this event. and Prof Rensburg's contribution to higher education and transformation is so eloquently captured in this amazing treatise, Serving Higher Purpose. It is testimony to one of the most innovative and disruptive leaders in higher education, which resulted in a turnaround strategy at the old RAU and the new UJ. I met Prof Ihron Rensburg as a lanky, handsome young man in the corridors of the Education Policy Unit at WITS, an NECC leader, newly graduated from Stanford. Our paths crisscrossed through his time at the DOE and then UJ, but mainly through being part of a community of scholars and activists in pursuit of social justice, equity, and equality. A formidable intellectual and an eloquent and non-compromising about speaking truth to power, his writings and higher Purpose, the book, encompass common themes of his other writings, of knowledge-making and epistemologies, the declining role of social movements, accountability, and the role of the state. All of these resonate with the key issues we face in higher education today and provide the guiding conceptual framework for the book. I think for many of us who have a shared history, in the 80s and the 90s, many of us straddle the roles of being organic intellectuals, as Gramsci describes, or as public intellectuals, as Mamdani notes. And Ihron Rensburg, in his own scholar activism, gave many of us the confidence to be who we are, whatever our race and class background. Indeed, he taught us that we could be scholars and activists, a much contested ground at that time. We were all obviously slightly in awe of him. The task for Prof Rensburg was cut out at UJ, and that was to dissolve the foundations of a racially balkanized university system with the starting principle that it should be socially just and based on the principles of an equitable distribution of resources and opportunities. And in his own words, he approached the task with the orders of Madiba, Mother Teresa, and Gandhi, giving root to the concept of progressive pragmatism, connecting the dots of every action to the desired goal of radically transforming university teaching, learning, research, and dynamically shaping our Pan-African future. I think the first task he faced, which we face today, and which was so evident again in the Fees Must Fall protests, was organizational change and culture. And in his own words, using Tuckman's theory, which he cites in the book, he asked, can you norm before you storm and disrupt? At UJ, the indicators of organizational change were dramatic and visible. The academic profile changed rapidly from white to black without compromising on merit, improved accountability, devolved leadership, and he recruited the academically most excellent and nurtured and created talent embodied by the Global Excellence in Stature program, a huge flagship program at UJ, and the Next Generation of Scholars program. I think in this organizational change, there were some important markers that stand out. The one is the establishment and his determination to establish the Soweto campus as a flagship campus, a Pan-African campus, important symbolically, but also the place where he hosted and we hosted Thomas Piketty, African presidents like Hole Soyinka, and cultural icons like Huma Sekela. South Africa, as we all know, have not been successful. And at UJ, we faced many skeptics who ask and still ask, how did you do it? In the last few months, during my time as head of the postgraduate school, we were asked by rating agencies how it was possible for us to double our doctorate output in 7 years. But there is at UJ an incredible sense of common purpose and a higher purpose to guide and steer the ship, providing a model of leadership which should be replicated. And I think this is one of the lessons that we get in the book. Often to disbelieving eyes, the UJVC constructed an alternative, non-elitist model with inclusive and diverse staff and student communities. Mergers and differentiation, as we've seen during COVID-19, continue to be marked presently in the COVID-19 landscape and continue to be an issue in higher education that we grapple with. I think for me, two things stand out about Prof Rensburg's tenure, and I think the book illustrates this. Firstly, it was his approach to what he calls academic citizenship. Academic citizenship was illustrated by the author's ability to deal with READ, the NGO, the National Planning Commission, Sarua, and all of these activities he engaged with great humility. And each, whether it was an NGO or a huge government initiative, was accorded the same degree of respect and attention. I think the other relevant lesson for us today, which we all reflect on, is on leadership. And I think for those of us who work in education, higher education leadership theory provides different types of leadership, which he often spoke about during his time at UJ. The one was servant leadership that emphasizes empowerment, involvement, and collaboration, and where the interests of others are placed above that of the leader. The second is distributive leadership, where responsibilities are distributed to a network of teams through the organization to improve the quality of the decisions. Both of these are what I witnessed in our VC, or our then VC. Maybe more on a more anecdotal level, is the author a tough leader? Absolutely. He expects high standards always. And because of this, we see that our accredited output at UJ doubled in the first decade, and UJ moved from being in the top 50 Pan-African universities to the top 5, again in university rankings. But the toughness that he displays was matched by the ability to engage and listen in great detail. He is the only leader I know who read every single report, every single table, and his attention to detail, and you could feel his displeasure about shoddy work by a look or an expression. And I often asked, and where you see in the book again, where does this boldness come from? It comes from his parents, his humble beginnings, the way he had to pay his way through school and college, working at factories, in the shoe factory at times, and obviously supported by his beloved family, Suzeka and Lizo. I'm about to end, Andre. So I think the big challenge we face in higher education, and one of the issues that faces us as critical progressive scholars who want to engage in the global stage, and the tensions in that. And I think this was illustrated by Prof Rensburg's view on rankings. His view was clear: universities don't serve rankings, but instead the greater and public good. And he critically engaged in these debates without any fear. He was absolutely clear that we are not Harvard wannabes, but something totally different. And he presented these uncomfortable views at various international fora, for example, the Council of Graduate Schools, the Rectors Forum, the U21 Network, and various other high-level international gatherings in the North, which quickly made him the poster boy or the poster man or the poster VC of the higher education leadership in the global South. And I received, on his behalf, many glowing acknowledgements. Finally, just in closing, one of the questions I think we face in higher education today is often what is presented as the binary between access and excellence. I came from WITS, a very different institution, and because so much my own work is on funding and equity, I think the big question we all ask is, how have the working classes benefited from these widespread reforms on funding in education? At UJ and under Prof Rensburg's tenure, I was introduced to the term accessible excellence, which gave hundreds, most probably thousands now, of first-generation university students the opportunity to enter higher education and succeed, which I witnessed in practice. And I think that is the biggest take-home I have from his time at UJ. There were many ways in which this was done: student bursaries, student support, supporting the missing middle, engagements with the private sector. And in a period of about 10 years, a student bursaries went up to about 10 billion. I think in his own words, he said, we were seeking to build access pathways for the rural and urban poor that would disrupt and subvert the normal capitalist reproduction of universities. So in conclusion, congratulations again, Prof Rensburg, and for sharing this amazing journey with us at UJ and outside of UJ. The lessons and learnings have a national and global reach, including in higher education, and will resonate with us for a long time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Shireen. I can't seem to start my video. So one of the hosts needs to start my video. Okay, thanks so much for that very powerful summary and reflections, Shireen. That's been great. And Mr. Makozoma, thanks for joining us. It is now my privilege, of course, to share a few bio notes on yourself with our audience and colleagues. Saki Makozoma is one of the most prominent business figures in South Africa. He is executive chairperson of Safika Holdings, group chairperson of Vodacom, and the director of Volkswagen South Africa. In addition to his business interests, Saki made a substantial contribution to civil society. He has served as chairpersons of the Council of the University of the Witwatersrand, the Council for Higher Education, and the Ministerial National Working Group on the restructuring of the higher education system in South Africa. He is currently a member of the Board of Governors of Rhodes University and the chairperson of the KwaZulu-Natal Philharmonic Orchestra. He has served as president of Business Leadership South Africa and as a member of the G20 Business Council. Thanks so much, Mr. Makozoma. The floor is yours. You can proceed, Mr. Makozoma. We can't hear you, Mr. Makozoma. Okay. We can't hear Mr. Makozoma at the present moment, so we'll sort out those audio challenges. In the meantime, can I then check that perhaps if Ihron and the Vice Chancellor is ready, we go into that session, and then we engage with Mr. Makozoma's input at the later stage. The conversation between Prof. Mutwa and Ihron Rensburg is set up as an interview with a set of 4 questions, and we will be shifting to that whilst we are sorting out the audio challenges for Saki. And let me introduce the 2 of them as a panel, and then of course hand over to the Vice Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University to take it forward. Prof. Rensburg is Administrator of our University of Technology, Chairperson of the South African National UNESCO Commission, Chairperson of the Ministerial Committee on the Review of the Higher Education Science and Technology Landscape, Senior Advisor to the Principal and Visiting Professor at King's College London, and Honorary Professor at Nelson Mandela University. He was Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg from 2006 to 2017, prior to which he was Chief Executive Strategic Services at the South African Broadcasting Corporation, Deputy Director General of South Africa's Department of Education, and General Secretary of South Africa's National Education Crisis Committee. Prof. Rensburg was Commissioner of South Africa's National Planning Commission, where he chaired the Working Group on Social Protection and Human Capabilities. He served as Executive Committee member of Universitas 21, Chairperson of the South African as well as the Southern African Universities Vice Chancellors Associations, Chairperson of the Ministerial Committee on Student Accommodation in South African Universities, member of the Ministerial Committee on the Funding of South African Universities, Council of the Association of Commonwealth Universities, and Governor of the Commonwealth of Learning. Prof. Rensburg holds a B Pharmacy degree at Rhodes University and an MA and PhD from Stanford University. He was awarded the Honorary Doctor of Laws degree by the University of the West Indies and the President's Medal for Global Leadership at the University of Southern Carolina and is an honorary fellow of King's College. Welcome, Prof. Rensburg. Let me introduce Prof. Sibongile Mutwa. Professor Mutwa is the Vice Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University. She has a distinguished career both in South Africa and internationally, working in development and public sector institutions and in academia. She is the former director of the University of Fort Hare's Institute of Government, a former Director General of the Eastern Cape Government, and the former Deputy Vice Chancellor Institutional Support of the Nelson Mandela University. She has served in various capacities to advance the public good, including duties as a trustee of the South African Women in Dialogue and as Commissioner and Deputy Chair of the Financial and Fiscal Commission of South Africa. She is the current chair of University South Africa, USAF, a membership organization representing the 26 South African public universities. She also chairs the Ministerial Task Team on Sexual Harassment and Gender-Based Violence and Harm in South African universities, and is a member of the Human Resource Development Council of South Africa. Prof. Mutwa, I now hand over to you. Many, many thanks to you and Prof. Rensburg.
Thank you, Professor Kiet, for those introductions. I want to start by thanking you and congratulating you and Professor Michael Cross for guiding and enabling and supporting this work. I want to add my words of welcome to all attending the book launch, a celebration of the intellectual work of Professor Rensburg. I want to congratulate Professor Rensburg for his commanding and successful leadership of the University of Johannesburg, but also for placing the testimony of the work that he did at the University of Johannesburg in the public discourse for all of us to learn from. I would like to, I will be failing if I do not greet Dr. Sizeka Rensburg and their son, Lizo Rensburg. Everyone, of course, is welcome. I would just, Professor Rensburg, just to start off, just to talk to your path to the University of Johannesburg. When I first opened the book, I could not put it down. As I moved through the opening pages, I found a great deal of myself in this work as another rank outsider in the academy. What came at me when I read the opening pages of your book is this sense of a circuitous rather than a straight path to this leadership role at the University of Johannesburg. And the fact that your vast personal and career pedigree was not necessarily, not at least initially, roundly regarded as the norm for someone like yourself with your pedigree to ascend to the role that you are now called into at the University of Johannesburg. I would like then, Professor, to request you to share with us your personal journey and your path to the University of Johannesburg.
Thank you very much, Sibonga Kulu. Please, let's drop the professor stuff if you don't mind. So I guess this is one of the big themes that kind of work their way through this book, or this account, if you like. Amy Tan, one of my favorite novelists, observes that we all carry on our shoulders the burdens of hundreds of generations that walked before us. For me, it's about how we negotiate these quote unquote burdens and responsibilities that really matters. It requires a presence of mind, an active awareness and a consciousness rather than mimicking and copying, and so fulfilling our so-called destiny. I'm reminded of my former boss and DJ Chabani Mangani, one occasion walking across the top floor of the new Department of Education's building, which of course was the old Department of Education and Training's building, old Bantu Education Department's building. And he saw me walking across and observed to me, "Doctor, you look rather comfortable in this building," which reminded me of the import of presence of mind and of memory. And so my closest contact with those generations of ancestors was through my grandparents, who nurtured me alongside and with my aunts and uncles. Mom, gentle, kind, humble, soft-speaking, pragmatic, nurturing, domestic worker. Dad, a no-nonsense, tough, dynamic blue-collar factory worker and entrepreneur, both offering plenty of wisdom. From my first ideas of executive presence, the observation would be in Afrikaans, excuse me, jy moet agter mekaar lyk, you have to look the part. Across to learning how to negotiate fast and slow thinking, fast and slow acting, to being time conscious, to getting things done. And that's where it all began, my journey, my coming and my becoming, of friendships, of comradeships, of imprisonments, of challenges, of accomplishments that followed, and the evolution of a complex and eclectic biography that has taken me through youth and student activism, through the privilege of leading local, regional, national, and international organizations, through Calvinism, agnostic Marxism, religious dissidence, radical and the transformatory religion, democratic socialism, and progressive pragmatism, through to learning about and practicing leadership charisma, learning for the first time at the age of 23, 24, alongside my comrades in the PE Youth Congress and PEPCO and other movements in Port Elizabeth, learning about and practicing this leadership charisma, standing in front of 20, 30,000 of our people, and learning how to engage them and how to move them, across to learning about and practicing and moving colleagues and our people behind ambitious and transformatory visions. And so these are biographies that cannot be summarized in resumes and in CVs. I'm also reminded of Eskia Mpahlele's understanding of our contributions and how we have made these to the worlds of science, intellectual endeavor, and philosophy. As he would have put it, that in our social imaginations, we Africans are first spiritual beings, and that our meaningfulness and our humanity derive from our recognition that we are only complete when our fellow human beings are complete, that we become better and worthy beings only when we elevate our neighbor. And so historic and contemporary experiences of Blackness, of being labeled, allegedly misunderstood, and then excluded, are repeated in the corridors of our mainstream organizations, whether here in South Africa or beyond. And it gives us a certain resilience, an ability to contest, to take on, and to build upon the status quo, our images of inclusive, caring, and of just societies. And so these are the accounts and the many stories that have shaped me. And there are many comrades and friends and colleagues and family who join us today on this occasion, who I'm immensely grateful for. My chairman of council at UJ, for example, asked me not so long ago, but Ihron, why do you have so many names in the book? And my response would have been, it's a reflection of the many accounts, the many journeys that have shaped me, that have contributed to my coming and my becoming, whether they are in the National Education Crisis Committee journey, or in the sports leadership journey. I had the privilege of leading the Grahamstown Soccer Association in my third year at university at age 20. It was a great honor and a great privilege where I learned to negotiate language across English and isiXhosa, and negotiating leadership in very complex and challenging settings. And unfortunately, as you point out, Sibongile, this is simply not taken account of. This is, in fact, discounted. And so one comes in as the outsider, which places enormous pressure on one in the shortest possible time to become the trusted insider. And in the book, I reflect on that journey of moving from the outsider to the trusted insider. And just one little footnote about that is really to observe that it involved a lot of humbling myself, learning, opening my ears, making copious notes, learning chapter and verse from each of the academics, senior academics and deans in my first 6 months in office, and then beginning to put in place with them plans to accelerate the university's transition, firstly through the merger, and secondly to advancing excellence, which I'm sure we will speak about today as well. So regrettably then, all of these insights, this eclectic biography that many of us carry like yourself, this is typically discounted, and we do so at a great loss to ourselves, whether in business, similar setting, or in industry, or in public entities. I think that we have to open our minds, open our hearts, open our social imaginations to embrace a wider range of persons. I know Adam Habib has, together with in conversation with me, struggled also to bring this kind of leadership, to lead what seems self-evidently easy, to lead a business school. Let's bring in different talent, more diverse and insightful talent. So an important set of issues that I explored in the book. Thanks very much, Sibongile.
Thanks. Thanks, Ihron. Thank you very much for those insights. Indeed, throughout the book, your sharpest ability for self-understanding and your ability to balance self-assurance and humility comes through, and it is the mainstay of the contribution that the book makes. Now, moving on, Ihron, to the next question I would like you to engage with. Your book, I've commented that it exceeds the author. It has the pulse and rhythm of a much bigger social project in the post-apartheid social and public psyche, nationally and internationally. Now, the question, did you have a sense of the symbolic enormity of the task when you accepted the job at UJ? How did you set out to lead such a complex venture? What were your thoughts at the beginning? What were your anxieties? And what strategies did you deploy? And what were the key elements of this assignment? Thank you.
Oh, that's a challenging set of questions, Sibongile. I guess the one thing about us as Africans that we constantly need to bring to the surface is the idea that that this is not about us as individuals. Yes, of course, we are given responsibility to to accomplish things. But at the same time, I make the point, perhaps on a number of occasions in the book, that it's vitally important for us not to take ourselves seriously. That vice chancellors, in this particular instance, myself, it's absolutely important to take the office seriously rather than oneself seriously. Separate the persona, the ego, and we know, of course, that these drive the being. But if one is able, from time to time, have the presence of mind to separate out the office and the persona, and focus on the office, the bigger, the more substantive, so to speak, then we would be able to accomplish that which hundreds of generations ago or earlier had been imagined, and that we now have to carry forward. And so, as Africans, and certainly those of us in the liberation movement, or coming from that tradition, unlike what we see today, sadly, has never been about self. It's always been about the higher purposes that we serve. It's always been about the greater good and the public good, so to speak. And so I appreciate your observation that this book, this account, is an account of many accounts within and of and for themselves. And so when I eventually took on this important role, I must concede some of the images that I had in mind in that first decade of our democracy were images of Pravin Gordhan having rebuilt a moribund SARS into an organization that has enabled our country to be able to come to where it is. I had in mind Phuthuma Nhleko, who had constructed with his team MTN from scratch. I had in mind Munhla Hlahla, who had constructed AXA into this extraordinary entity. And then, of course, there were images also of SA Breweries, of Vodacom, of DSTV, and of the turnaround at the SABC that I was honored to be a part of. And so all of these and the many others that can come to mind, the many departments that we had constructed that as really excellent and excelling government entities in those first decades, so to speak, all of these reflect the higher purposes that we serve, that of building institutions, public and private institutions, that reflect more our post-apartheid democracy than our apartheid dictatorship, so to speak. And so all of these played in my mind as I began to sit down with my colleagues, my team, and as we began to recruit new members into the team. These all played in my mind the idea of success, the idea of accomplishment, the idea of serving higher purposes and of the public good. Also, I had just recently at the time then been involved in the UNISA merger under the stewardship of Matthew Sporsa, our chairman at the time. I chaired the merger steering committee, and we assisted to the extent that we were able, from a council perspective, Bani Pikana and his team in building the new university. And then, of course, I had also observed Malagapura Mahoba's early journey at UKZN. And internationally, I always had an eye on Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, always an eye on its journey as it was seeking to turn around under Bertel Anderson, again, a moribund public administration to a great public university. And so The great anxieties, of course, always is the fact that you're an outsider coming in. And so the big challenge was to win over the support of my management colleagues. And one of the persons who really stood out at the time was our registrar. I will never forget. I will continue to live with this image of Mari Miller, just moved from deanship to the role of registrar, and taking on with great aplomb and energy and passion the role of registrar, and driving very hard the merger of the institution. And of course, I think of Adam, I think of Anjana Parekh, I think of Chilitsi Marwala, and many of our other colleagues who, without whom we would not have been able to accomplish this journey. And so winning over the support of the management team, becoming a trusted ally was a big challenge. And it's work, and you will see it in the book as I reflect on it. Winning over Senate was always going to be a great challenge, and the strategy there was to win over the deans and senior academics, and it meant, as I mentioned a moment ago, spending the first 6 months basically in wall-to-wall meetings, listening, hearing, dialoguing, pushing colleagues, challenging them, encouraging them, sharing my own ambition, my own dreams for the institution, and eventually putting in place, as I show in the book, catalytic initiatives that began to demonstrate that I'd listened, that I'd heard, and that with a management team, we had listened, we had heard, and that we were able to respond to their calls and to action. Of course, the big issue in leadership of academic institution is whether academics can be led, and whether academics can benefit from leadership. And I was of the firm view, I remain of the firm view that there is place for academic leadership. And so, excuse me. And so took on the challenge. And so, of course, the theoretical and philosophical question, therefore, about leadership in a university setting is the question, at least for me, as I try and articulate it in the book, is, so what does academic freedom and institutional autonomy serve? For they cannot be ends in themselves. There are colleagues who argue that they're ends in themselves. And I take a view that these are means for us to be able to achieve our higher purposes. Those higher purposes about nurturing inclusive, caring, prosperous, diverse, and embracing nations. Not only nations, of course, lower down the order, embracing organizations in business and industry and in communities, embracing universities at the same time. And so I would have this dialogue inside myself and with colleagues about the virtues of academic leadership. And in particular, how do we bring into play, in a manner that is sensitive to our setting, the useful traits of so-called managerialism. I don't want to go into corporate, into academic capitalism for the moment. I'm specifically focusing on managerialism with its new traditions, the last 20, 30-year traditions of strategic planning, of annual performance agreements, of performance scorecards, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was able with my team to bring these into play, initially with some difficulty, but in time, by year 3 and 4, we had smoothed out the difficulties. And by year 7, 8, 9, 10, we were able to pull back to a far softer stewardship once our academics and the academic leaders had been activated, so that they could take direct responsibility, Shireen mentioned earlier, in distributed leadership for leading their faculties and leading their teams. But of course, I take seriously the challenge of managerialism and corporatization of the university on the one hand, and our responsibility to advocate and defend academic freedom and institutional autonomy. It is about pragmatism in the end. It is about heading back to the idea of the higher purpose that we serve, whether we're in public or private institutions. So those are just some of the many challenges that I face. I should just say one last thing here, and that is, I guess, I hope a helpful suggestion, and that is, don't be too obsessed with adversaries. Simply focus on your role and responsibility. Initially, at least in the first 12 months, 24, 36 months, it's important to build the team. Don't be distracted by adversaries. At the same time, as I point out in the book, those first 2-3 years are absolutely critical for resetting the organization, turning it around. At the same time, it's critical that you don't light too many fires that then burn the whole building down. By that, I simply mean you can't be firing people, dismissing people left, right, and center. It simply is going to burn down the house. And therefore, it's absolutely important for you to focus on your strategy execution, and give every colleague an opportunity, assist them, nurture them to the extent that you are able to, encourage them, back them up, rather than as you, I guess the language of some of the harsh business cultures, spit them out, so to speak. So that would be something I would advise, and it's something that I just reflect on also in the book. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ihron, for those insights, which obviously for some of us that have seen the book, all those lessons are coming out very clearly from the book. And what stands out for me is how you have been able to quite openly draw strength from the visionaries that you saw around you, and also to be able to insert yourself in the team and to be able to work as a collective. And thirdly, you pose a question, whether can academics be led? I think that just looking around and reading your book is that I think academics, the best way you would have led them is your ability to steward the university in a manner that makes them proud to continue to do their work. And I think that comes across very well in the book. I just want to touch on a question that actually Shireen touched on this in her opening comments, which is one of the most damaging discourses that has taken hold of our intellectual imaginations, which is the idea that excellence and equity, diversity and transformation, quality and justice are mutually exclusive, that they cannot exist together. I would like you to share with us, as you do so well in the book, how the UJ project set out to combat these myths, and what lessons do the UJ project put forward for those in business, in academia, in public leadership in general in this regard? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Spongile. Hey, challenging questions that you raised there. I want to kick off with a simple observation, and that is that things are not there naturally. Everything that we see in organizations, let's stick to organizations for the moment, organizational culture, organizational rules, just to pick on those, these have not emerged or evolved as an autonomous and natural process, but they are the result of people putting them in place. I want to reference Peter L. Berger from his book, The Social Construction of Reality, a treatise in the sociology of knowledge from published in 1966, in which he puts the point very crisply. And I quote, "The reality of everyday life is taken for granted as reality. It does not require additional verification over and beyond its simple presence. It is simply there as self-evident and compelling facticity." And then on similar lines, Benedict Anderson in 1991 in his book Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism, slightly different angle, looking at it at a national level. He makes the point that nations are imagined because the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. And he continues, nations are communities, regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each apologies. The nation, he continues, is always conceived as a deep horizontal comradeship. Ultimately, it is this fraternity that makes it possible over the past 2 centuries for so many people, not so much to kill as willingly to die for such limited imaginings. And so I simply bring this to the surface to make the point that when we enter organizations, it is quite easy for us to succumb to the structure that we find, to the culture that we find, to the rules that we find. And yet we are called upon to serve higher purposes. And so I guess a couple of footnotes in response to your important question. But the first step, I believe, was to encourage colleagues out of their self-referential approach to work and to life, and to encourage them to adopt a far more external referencing. I'm reminded all the time about the late Kader Asmal's injunction to us in the Department of Education at the time. He would remind us that it's important not only to look inside one's heart, quoting an Irish poet, it's important not only to look inside one's heart for self-validation, but also to look outside oneself for one's works, for one's actions, and for the results of those works and of those actions. And so it's important for us as we enter our organizations to spend time self-consciously to examine the institution, to examine ourselves as individuals, and of course the various parts, moving parts of the institution or of the organization, and then to be able to establish what differentiates us, what's unique and special about us, and then to begin to build upon and to construct our identity of differentiation around those points of difference, or those points of excellence. I guess when I walked into the university, it was always then about presenting one model of a post-apartheid democracy university, and entering or presenting that for our or catalyzing our social imagination. It was never about the model. It was always about a model. Coming from the history that I carry on my shoulders, so to speak, in Amy Tan's language, it was about turning on its head the old idea of the university. And the fact is that university is still conceived in every township, in every rural setting, is still conceived as an institution of the elites, for the elites. It is still imagined in the social imagination, coming from a blue-collar working class setting. It is the exception to the rule for a child coming from those settings to imagine that they can transcend those settings, and transcend it in numbers, not in exceptions, so to speak. And so one of the ambitions, therefore, yes, was about the post-apartheid university identity, but it was also about turning on its head the elitist imagery of the university. And so when we set out in 2005, 6, 7 on this journey, we had about 8% of our students coming from quintile 4 and 5 schools. These are schools that serve the poorest in our nation, the poorest 2 quintiles in our nation. The settings of these schools are pretty familiar for all of us. And so the question was, how do we turn that around? How do we bring that closer to the equivalent of 2 quintiles of first years? Those students, pupils, coming from those representing close to 40% of our first year enrollment, and then over the years reaching 40% or close to 40% of all enrollment in undergrad and postgrad education. So a very ambitious dream, so to speak. By the time I left the university, we had reached about 32%. So 32% of our first year students were now coming from these settings. And so you can imagine we've got about 11,000 first year students entering, close to 3,500 of them coming from these settings. And 10 years later, you have moved 35,000 students coming from these settings. And so the idea is simply, if 25 universities could do the same, or at least endeavor to accomplish the same, then we would indeed be serving our higher purpose, at least in my social imagination of the great university, as an inclusive, as an embracing university that's reflective in its demography, both students and staff demographies for that matter. And so on the student side, of course, it meant mapping in poverty into the institution. And I reflect in the book on how we made sure then that access does not become a revolving door for students coming from settings where perhaps 50–60% of the academic curriculum had been completed, and there were huge gaps, therefore, in the knowledge of our first year entering students. And so it was about reimagining the idea of the university. It was also about driving hard on the academic inclusion side, the diversity side. And so we were able, with a few catalytic initiatives, to to begin the journey of transforming our academic student body, our academic body, faculty body, from about 15% Black academics now to close to 44% Black academics, plus a further 15% African academics from the broader continent and the diaspora. And so about excellence. As we were driving hard on the inclusion and diversity agenda, and of course that work is unfinished because cultures tend to endure. And that is the work of Chilitsi and the team at UJ right now as we speak, is to challenge the residual culture or aspects of the residual culture in the institution, a culture that still struggles to affirm and to embrace those who had been previously deliberately excluded from the setting. And so the idea then was to, as I pointed out earlier, to differentiate ourselves, to begin to build and focus on those key differentiators. And because we did have the degrees of freedom, the financial degrees of freedom as a predominantly historically white institution, as Brian O'Connell, the former VC at UWC, would constantly remind me about, if he was here, he would remind me even right now about it. But the point, of course, is when you do have the degrees of freedom, then you should put it to use to this higher purpose, the greater good, the public good. And so we were able then to mobilize our academics, both on the teaching and learning front, to strive for excellence, and on the research front equally, to provide them with the capabilities and the support to strive for excellence. From simple things, such as growing our postdoctoral fellow cohort from a low 20s to close to 300, a major intervention that we introduced in the institution, both to provide, on the one hand, an academic journey for these new PhD graduates, but also to catalyze their research ambitions within our research groups inside the institution. We're also able to grow the university's academic staffing, permanent staffing, by slowly beginning to reduce the temporary staffing. We're able to grow our academic staffing by almost 45%. And so around these interventions, we then built excellence. And as we speak, the university now produces more than 1,000 master's graduates, more than 200 odd PhDs, and more than 2,200 research units in the South African parlance, which equates probably to about 5,000 papers per annum. So a significant contribution that the university is making to public scholarship and to scholarship that matters. And so the question that you asked, did we have an idea about a great South African university? No, that was never top of mind. Greatness, to be quite frank, is never top of mind. It is about the day-to-day grind to connect all of these day-to-day activities pragmatically into progressing and stewarding the institution in service of this nation, the continent, and the world, and in service of its higher purpose. But I agree absolutely. We have a false dialogue in South Africa that separates excellence from diversity and inclusion, and these should be pursued together, as we have demonstrated at the University of Johannesburg. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Ihron. Very thought-provoking and challenging for us that are still remaining in the sector, that the challenges that you started to tackle, they still remain to balance excellence and making sure that you leave the door wide open for those who could never have imagined coming to university, coming there and succeeding. And hence I like your term in UJ of accessible excellence. So thank you very much for that. And you have left us with a lot of challenges. And I'm going to just ask a last short question now, which you have spoken to some of its aspects already. I say this advisedly. The UJ project has emerged as one of the great major success stories of our time. It got a quick national traction, as Shireen did reflect on this, and global traction, generating the soundtrack of new, vibrant, and I'm going to pause on vibrant because UJ got to be seen, at least by the younger generation, as that. A new generation university built on some of the remnants of the apartheid higher education landscape, which you had started tackling even when you were still outside the university. And then I just want to ask, did you envision the identity of a great university, a post-apartheid university, when you took up the UJ post, or you set out realizing this as you were going on? And tell us about this picture in your social imagination, that what did you say when it's actually done? How will I look at it? How did you put all this to work to turn UJ into a sought after university by, I think I say all classes of our society, including those students, as you were saying, from the poorest quintiles, and we believe that it's a job that has been done well. And but how did you model and position UJ as a vibrant new generation university? I think this is going to be my last question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bongile. Very quick response. Could of course be, please get hold of the book. But I just want to, because of time, perhaps just give one or make one observation. And that is that part of the great challenge of leading our institutions, whether it is our universities or whether it is transitioning or turning around private organizations and entities, is that in our imagination, this is always the way it's been. This is always how it's looked. This will endure time immemorial. And I really, in my work, really try to challenge those ideas or those conceptions or social imaginations. Consider, for example, before the current COVID crisis, we hardly imagined online or blended learning, by way of example. And so I think back of my first years at UJ and having I guess what helped in my instance was having a 15-year-old, 16-year-old son who was ready to journey into university, observing his journey and realizing that our universities are simply not ready for this new generation Y. Forget about Generation Z. And that we, at simple levels, we did not have wall-to-wall high-speed Wi-Fi. We were still using traditional ways and means of teaching. We were not making use of the new technologies that these young people are using on a day-to-day basis. And so I was convinced in my mind that this generation would be utterly frustrated because we are force feeding them in our traditional ways of teaching, learning, and research and assessment, for that matter. And so with the team, we spent a lot of time dialoguing and reflecting on this. And eventually we began that journey of putting in place these basic requirements and of activating ambassadors for blended learning and teaching, and for the use of all of these modern technologies in the lecture halls. And around that, as we began the journey, around that, we constructed this image in the public mind and in the social imagination of a university that is energetic, that's dynamic, that's vibey, that's youthful, that is in touch, that is connected, to use the language of the young people, that's on point, that's diverse, that's embracing them. And so that was the wraparound image that we sought to project into the public mind and social imagination. Of course, it was our challenge then to close the gap between the experience itself, that is the experience itself, and the vision and the image that we were projecting in the public mind. And I think that journey continues, but I do believe that we have made some good progress in this regard. I'm using this simply to illustrate that the agenda was never about building a great university. This came into play perhaps only in the last 5 years of the journey at UJ, in which I and my colleagues were beginning to contest the idea of what is a great university. Is a great university one that is only ranked, that's ranked very highly for that matter, in international rankings, and we all crow over that, and yet at the same time our culture is rotten, our traditions are rotten, they're outdated, they don't embrace, they don't elevate, they provide revolving doors, so to speak, for children coming from the poor, rural and urban settings. They are revolving doors for Black academics who struggle to settle in the institution and eventually pushed out. Institutions that don't close the gap between what it projects and what the experience is in the institution. And I reflect in chapter 9 in the book, reflecting on fees must fall, and make the point there that much of this gap between the experience and the imagery of a great university that's highly ranked much of that gap accounts for fees must fall, accounts for the what do I call it? The militancy, the combativeness of fees must fall and of roads must fall. The belief that we are not going to get anything out of these institutions because the gap is so big. They speak something and they walk something else. And so that's what we were seeking to reimagine, the idea that we could bring together all of these into one. And it's a journey that continues. It's an unfinished revolution, so to speak. Thanks very much, Sibonge.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ihron. I've enjoyed the conversation, and you have given us great insights. And I think those that are yet to read the book, they will be very much wanting to read the book now. So thank you very much, and for all that you continue to do for our sector and for our country. I'm going to hand back now to our colleague Andre to continue with the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ihron and VC. This has been a fascinating discussion, captivating in so many different kinds of ways. So I would like just for Dr. Dupree, because there are some very, very energetic discussions on the Q&A and the chat coming through from other online platforms as well. I'm just going to ask Dr. Dupree to quickly share. Then after that, we'll ask Mr. Sakima to do his reflections. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Prof. Ihron. So there's been a lot of questions coming through, and I'd just like to extend the congratulations of everyone from the YouTube forum on the book to Prof. Rensburg, because you can't see those. So yeah, I've just got a few selected questions here. Firstly, from Slihangule Siwisa. He says here, in the pursuit of intellectual endeavor as writers, I am often curious to know whether we are mirrors that reflect what society is like, or are we wishing wells that society gazes into in order to see what society can become? If we are mirrors, then our own shortcomings are reflective of our society. If we are wishing wells, then we are entrapped on a pedestal that forces us to live up to the values we espouse in our work. And then more on the side of higher education, Naren Bejnath asks, after an eventful and illustrious career, what is it that makes you optimistic for the future of higher education? And conversely, is there anything that is cause for despair? And then I couldn't cover all the questions in the short time we have available, but one of the themes that came up constantly in the questions was the question of effective leadership for transformation, and how we might make change regardless of barriers in higher education, government, society, and in policy. So how do we share those ideas of leadership that are espoused in the book? So thank you. I'm not sure if we've lost Prof. Ihron. Prof. Rensburg, would you like to respond?
Yes, Prof. Rensburg, can respond.
I think those are great questions. I suspect we've kind of run out of time. I think the challenging question there about, let me just find that question quickly again. So you know, as writers, what do we do? I think it's a great question. I think that on one hand we reflect, we are mirrors. On the other hand, I'm hoping that we offer at the same time ambitions and dreams, and we reflect hopefully back and forward, back into the past and into the future in ways that that enable present and future generations to pick up the baton, so to speak. Effective leadership for transformation. I guess I reflect throughout the book on this, and it's about connecting, as I put it in the book, every single step, every action, every ambition, every set of dreams and hopes, connecting them to the vision and to the greater or higher purpose of the institution. I think that the great challenge for effective change leaders is to be able to, yes, to listen, to hear, to respond, to engage humbly, to do all of these things correctly so. But at the same time, it is about constant communication, and of course, effective communication, dialogical communication, self-critical communication. And so communication, I think, features high, in addition to this ability to constantly connect every action to the strategy, to the vision, and to the greater purpose that the institution serves. And I guess the third thing that I would encourage is, again, can we separate our personas, our egos, that which makes us feel good? Can we separate that from the office and from the role of the office? Because the good feeling will come in the results through people. Please keep in mind, we achieve through people. We can never accomplish the great ambitions, the great dreams that our nation has of us, that our institutional communities, organizational communities have of us, that our councils and our boards have of us. We cannot accomplish any of that without our colleagues. And so it does mean for an effective transforming leader, it's important, vitally important, to be nurturing colleagues, to be supporting them, to challenge them, to encourage them, to praise them. So those are just some thoughts on some of the issues. I want to end off by saying that perhaps the great challenge for our universities, and for that matter for organizations in the private sector, is to close the gap between what we espouse, what we say, and the actual lived experience in our organizations and institutions. That is the great challenge. It is about the gap between students, what we promise, and the experience. It is the gap between what we promise to our staff and the experience. It's about closing those gaps. It is then that we will be able to become even far more effective, perhaps, than we are at this point in time, and to be conscious of that gap between promise and lived experience. Thanks very much, Andre.
Thanks so much, Ihron. And now, of course, I'm going to ask Saki just to come through here, just to alert the audiences on the different platforms that the book is available, and you can acquire it in many different kinds of ways. But I also think that this has been a great discussion between you and the audience and Sibongile, and so we will try and make the video available as soon as we can. Okay. So can I now, colleagues, just hand over to Saki Makozoma to do his reflections. And then after that, I will ask Michael Cross to say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me now. My apologies for the technological issues earlier on. It's a bit of an awkward way to start because my remarks are supposed to be before the other panelists have spoken. And in a way, many of them have covered many of the points that I wanted to raise. But I wanted to start by saying that it's important that Ihron has decided to record his experience and his learnings from managing this particular transition, particularly at this time, because we are facing a dire situation where, in fact, we have allowed many projects of this nature, many transformational projects of this nature, to flounder on the rocks of lack of leadership skills, of incompetence, of greed, of conspiracy, and all of these bad things. So I think this is important, that there is a record out there of the successes of the transformation project in its entirety, so that those who may not have the historical memory could have reference points about the fact that the transformation project in its entirety is not a lost cause. So I think that's important to note. I think that Ihron was the best person to have chosen. So I want to have been chosen for this particular task at this university at this time. And I would like to thank those who sought him out, because he was not a natural choice for the position, and there was resistance to it. But there were people who had the vision to say, even though he is not a natural choice, he has the experience and he has the vision to lead this project. Because part of what we suffer in this country is when these kinds of opportunities for leadership to emerge, we go and find the wrong people. And I think if you listen to the Zondo Commission, like I do, you wonder where some of the people who are appearing in front of this commission were found, because if you went into the marketplace of talent and you found those people, I don't know where you would find them. I'd like to share with you what, for me, are some of the distinguishing and distinguished factors of Ihron's leadership, which he records in the book. Naturally, many of those have been touched on, but let me put them in a summary form. The first one for me is his ability to put on the table a simple but powerful vision that can be embraced by many people, by all in the institution, and benefit all, and also clearly in the public interests. I think we can take this lightly, but it is very, very important in situations of transition to find a vision that you can mobilize around, which is not compromising or compromised itself. The mantra he speaks about, which has been referred to already, which is to provide accessible excellence, is in a great payoff word, in the sense that it's easy to conceive, but it is pregnant with meaning. And my understanding of that, for instance, is inclusive and diverse student and staff communities, which you have spoken to already. An upward and accelerating teaching and research excellence, and also to achieve a benchmark setting measure, which was the aspiration. It's an easy and an embraceable vision, because everybody is able to go back whenever, whatever action that may be controversial that is taken, and say, is this consistent with the vision? So everybody understands, everybody feels included in it, and that's quite critical. Secondly, I think, is the importance of a clear strategy. And Ihron makes a point that, amongst other things, that you need to tackle all challenges simultaneously and not sequentially. And he also makes the emphasis on the importance of the first 90 days, which is a concept we have all borrowed from the American presidents. Your first 90 days are the days that are critical for the starting of the journey, because if you don't do the things that you need to do in the first 90 days, people get demobilized and think that nothing will ever happen. The third lesson for me that emerges from this book is people management. On part of Ihron, he's spoken to it already. A listening culture, managing anxieties, create safe spaces for people, nurture ambition, confidence and hope, optimism and resilience, and nurture positive intellectual discourse and avoid academic inbreeding. Now, all of those from a people management perspective are quite critical if one is going to hold together an institution of the type that the new University of Johannesburg was at the time of his taking the responsibility. The fourth one for me is the emphasis on personal behaviors, his emphasis on personal behaviors that reinforce the strategy of managing change. And he's made reference to this, for instance, taking notes in meetings so people can feel that they are listened to. And I've got examples in my own life of people who you can tell when they disengage by behaviors that they enter into. Personal behaviors, for instance, like email etiquette, respond to people on time, no matter how mundane and pedestrian you may think that it is important to them. Preparation for meetings, including hours of reading. In my own personal experience, I know that if people come to the conclusion that you go to meetings unprepared, including your own and others, they then take chances with you. But also for the people who work very hard to prepare reports for you, and then you just don't read them. Even if you're critical of them, you can only be critical if you've read. So the preparation. So all of these personal behaviors are important in reinforcing the emerging culture of the new institution. The fifth lesson for me is building credibility for the transition, so that everyone, in that context, that everyone must grow and be nurtured, so that the transition is not for some people, or the future that we're transitioning to is not for some people, but it is for all of us, and that we all have the space to grow. And of course, some of us may never be able to grow, in which case there is an exit way, but the opportunity is afforded to all. So it's very important, therefore, to build the credibility for the transition. I think the way Ihron puts it, that his intention was to win back the university's publics, that UJ was the right university for them, was a part of this building of credibility for the transition. I think I would like to add to that prudential financial management, because if one looks across the higher education landscape and the challenges that have come in relation to the stewardship of financial and other university resources, that has been a challenge, and that's very critical for an enterprise of this nature. The sixth one for me is how to deal with setbacks. And people forget, I mean, that there were many setbacks that Ihron faced. The bombing of the main auditorium in 2015 is one example. The contestations between unions at UJ, Nahau and NUMSA particularly. The stampede in which Gloria Sikwana died. All of these were setbacks in the process. So this shouldn't be seen as a plain sailing. And a leader in this kind of context needs to be able to deal with the setbacks without making them permanent features. And I like Ihron's view on this when I quote him when he says, dissolving crisis requires another capability, recognition that it is time to shift from administrative, office-bound and defensive leadership style to one that I will call activist and on-the-ground leadership. So that's an important response and a preparedness, I think, intellectually and emotionally to deal with the kind of setbacks and to change your leadership style in response to that, so that you are able to make sure that they don't ossify those setbacks. Finally, I'd like to say Professor Rensburg considers the future of the African university and the catch-up we need to do with the rest of the world to create leading institutions and increase the participation rates of our people in higher education. He concludes that the role of the African states in this endeavor will be constrained by the structure of the economies, the extractive industries, and the volatility of commodity prices and many other challenges that and competing needs that our societies have. So noting that the universities will rely on limited private funding, he argues that, quote, there is a need to defend the indisputable value and role of contextualized academic freedom and institutional autonomy. This is a message not only for the state, but is more critical for the private sector to embrace. And I think that we need a conversation between the private sector and the higher education institutions and society broadly as to what the role is and should be of the private sector, particularly in coming to the party in terms of the diminishing resources from the state that are directed to higher education. So for me, those are the important lessons. But you know, I have grown up with Ihron over the years, and his reference to the Grahamstown Soccer Association and the KwaZakhele Soccer Board, which we led over the years when we were still youngsters, is where I first met Ihron. And on that, just what I learned from him in those days and in the years of struggle, I was completely not surprised by the quality of leadership that he provided at UJ, as well as his reflection after that stint of what were the lessons for us and for him. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Sagi. That's beautifully put. And in fact, it worked out, by the way, that you then came after the conversation. So next time we may want to think of redesigning it based on technical challenges. So thanks so much for that. Eh?
Thank you.
Right, Michael, it's over to you. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Andre. I think the precision with which previous speakers have spoken about Ihron's contribution hasn't left any space for me. So I'm going to try and take it to a slightly different level and look at his contribution in terms of scholarship and in terms of knowledge. Now, so let me start by saying that the issue, by acknowledging that the issue of university leadership in South Africa has been a neglected issue. And it's even worse when we attach that to critical scholarship. So if we go back to the agenda, the critical agenda set by people like Jabavu in the 1930s, Mafeje, Ben Maguban, and others. I mean, those are voices that have faded away, and very little has been done in the domain of university leadership. And even across the continent, the voices of Al-Mazrui and the voice of Mahmoud Mandani are also fading away. So this is the challenge that our book series is attempting to address, is a modest attempt to address this particular challenge. And we would see Ihron's contribution as setting the pace in this process. We've removed, as Andre has mentioned, we've changed the title of the series. And in changing the title, we've removed the word critical. But I would say that the meaning of critical scholarship remains, at least in three different ways. The first one and the primary way is basically about opening, providing a platform to an emerging intellectual movement that we are seeing with Ihron's contribution, which tries to reconcile the challenge of development with the challenge of social justice. And I think those are the two dimensions that I see as defining this particular piece at a different level, at the level of scholarship. The second one is it shares what seems to be our political epistemology, a set of beliefs about social order, about how knowledge interfaces with issues of power, issues of interest in our own institutions, and in society at large. It also shares what seems to be our social epistemology, a conception of knowledge concerned with the role of knowledge in systemic, institutional, and social change. These are three dimensions that I think that are reflected in this particular contribution when we look at it from the point of view of our series. So we need to know what types of knowledge we require for transforming our institutions. And in another contribution made by Ihron that will be announced, the launch will be announced soon, Liz Langer refers to that kind of knowledge that we need for transforming our institutions as knowledge for transformation. An understanding of how we conceptualize, design, generate, and implement change in our institutions. We need to understand what we do when we're transforming our institutions. Liz Langer refers to that as knowledge of transformation. These are the key two dimensions that I think that we really need, and Ihron has gone a long way in providing a base for reflection about these issues as we engage in the process of transforming our own institutions. Now, about Ihron himself as an author. I mean, there's so much I can say about that. But I remember about 15 years ago, I was interested in writing something, a piece about the kinds of knowledge that senior leaders, university leaders, administrators, if you want to call them that way, that's the way they were called them at the time. What kind of knowledge did they draw on when they lead institutions like these, universities? And when I asked one of the experts, on knowledge issues from the University of Cape Town, and the response that I got was none. So it made me actually think that, well, if that's the case, then it means that university leaders draw on experiential knowledge, whatever they bring out of their own experiences. But in looking carefully in their offices, I realized that they had a number of books displayed dealing with issues of leadership, of management. But perhaps what seems to be missing in those books was the word context and experience. So what have we learned from Ihron when it comes to these two dimensions of how the theory of leadership can be based on actual experience and takes into account the context in which they lead? So I think that Ihron brings to us the notion that good practice requires reflection, a good theory, and a good theory takes context and experience very seriously. I think that's perhaps one of the most revealing dimensions of this. When you look at the biography, when you look at the actual practice, and you look at the ideas informing his reflections. We can say that from 1994, there has been desire, a great deal of desire to experiment, to introduce innovative ideas in our institutions. And many vice chancellors came with the grand ideas. And I think it is within this framework that Ihron developed a base that has shaped UJ as it is today. But what seems to be missing in this case is a reflection of those experiences. We don't know what happened to those ideas. Very little has been written about the outcome of these grand ideas that have been introduced in many institutions. So the value of Ihron's in this regard is actually about drawing attention to the practice of theorizing our experiences. And that's critical, not just for us, for future leaders, but for ourselves and for all those people in leadership in institutions. And I think that's a real, very significant dimension that I see from his contribution. And one thing which is really critical in his case is that if we're going to transform our institutions effectively, we need suitable knowledge for transformation and of transformation. And what Ihron's book does is it brings these two dimensions, the kinds of reflections and knowledge that we need in order to transform, but on the other hand, an understanding of what transformation is all about the process itself. So the book brings the two dimensions together. So I think that's basically the kind of work that we've been looking for in our series. And in this case, we'd like to thank Ihron. Anyway, I would like just to thank, first of all, not just Professor Rensburg, I would say Professor Rensburg, because I'm looking at him now as my Vice Chancellor those days, and also to thank his successor, Professor Marala, and Professor Mutua at NMU for having created a dynamic environment that makes initiatives like this possible. And I know this wouldn't be possible if the environment wasn't conducive. I would like to thank the organizing team, both from UJ and from NMU. And I think they've set a good example. And in the future, we already have really an example of how these things can be done successful in the future. I would like to thank all participants who have tuned on YouTube for this particular event. And of course, I must say that we'd like to see them also for our next event, which is the launch of the second book by Ihron Rensburg and colleagues that will take place in November. And well, of course, my friends and partners, Andre and Shireen, I think we can teach many people how to collaborate in diversity. Thanks. Back to you, Andre.
Okay, thanks so much, Michael. This brings us to the end of a great event. Thanks so much, Ihron, for putting this on the table and for everybody who participated, both here on Zoom and via the Q&A on YouTube. Have a lovely rest of the day, colleagues. And yeah, we'll see each other again at one of these book launches in the series. Great stuff. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.